Praise be to God in all things. Thank you, Rudy, for keeping us up to date. Joining us right now via Zoom chat is Colton Marks. He is the editor of the manuscript for the life of the Venerable Louis de Ponte, and it is published by Mediatrix Press. Good morning to you, Colton Marks.
Good morning, Joe. How are you?
Praise be to God. I am alive, and that counts. How are you, sir?
I'm good. I'm doing well.
Now, you are, this real quick, you're in St. Louis, I hear, and you're studying?
So I'm currently a senior finishing up studies in art history and philosophy at St. Louis University.
Wow, praise be to God. And plans next? What are you thinking? What's God calling you to?
I'm currently working with a few different things, but I have no specific plans yet.
Well, we'll be praying for you for sure. This is a fascinating book that you have sent us, The Life of the Venerable Louis de Ponte. I like the description. I'm going to read this a little bit for the sake of our listeners. It says, the 16th century was a golden age for the church in Spain, producing great thinkers such as Victoria and Suarez, and mystics such as St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross. A jewel hidden among their number is the Venerable Father Louis de Ponte, S.J., born in Valladolid in 1554. De Ponte lived in a pure and innocent life, advancing much in spirituality and learning. He was the administrator of the Jesuit order and retired due to ill health to devote himself to spiritual writing. In this book, you will learn the hidden life of the largely unknown Father, discover the wonders of his spiritual teaching and his great love for our Lord in the Holy Eucharist, his devotion to Our Lady, as well as the heights of his mystical contemplation. I find this fascinating because, you know, it never ceases to surprise me to find hidden gems like this. You'd think we've got it all, we've learned it all, we've discovered it all, and yet the church and her patrimony still has more for us. Tell us about this.
Well, so what's interesting is I'm not a big reader. It takes a lot for me to get into a book. In college, the books that kept coming to me that I could actually read and get through and loved were Lives of the Saints. So my sophomore year, I read Lives of some of the Desert Fathers. And then my junior year, I just started prowling the stacks of the library and would come across these books of all these saints. We have a very extensive theological library at SLU. And I would just pick random ones off the shelf. And one time I picked up this really big one by The Life of Don Bartholomew the Martyrs that was written by Luis of Granada. And I loved Luis of Granada reading his Sinner's Guide. And that book was too big for me to lug around campus. So I would read that in my apartment, and then I needed a smaller book. So I just went through the stacks again, and I came across what's been one of the greater acts of providence in my life in college, was picking off The Life of Louis de Ponte. And Luis, I mean, when I started reading it, the first line opens up that he was by birth a Spaniard, a great example and master of Christian perfection, and in the science of mystical theology, one of the most celebrated doctors of his age. And I think the beauty of his life, especially the life that was written in 1882 in English, it's the edifying thing about it is it shows that this man in many ways was like the epitome of virtue and walking in the Christian life. It wasn't easy. You know, this wasn't something that was just given to him. I think the temptation is to think that saints were just like divinely favored all of their lives and they were chosen to be special and that was that. It's like, no, they had to work in the Lord's vineyard. And that's what's so beautiful about this book is that it tells the story of his life, but tells it in such an intimate way in how he walked in the way of virtue and practicing virtue, and how he lived union with God, and how that was the one thing on his mind at all times. And so I think that because it's structured where you get to a certain point in his life, it talks about his spiritual writings that he started rolling out in his infirmed ages, and then it like pauses the narrative of the story, and you get 110 pages of just chapters on all of the virtues. Starts with charity towards God, then a whole chapter on charity towards neighbor, then a whole chapter on his humility, his faith, his hope in God, his prayer, his devotion to Our Lady, the Blessed Sacrament. So you're not just reading like your stereotypical life of the saint that's bogged down with all this historical content. You're reading, like the description says, the intimate life of one who knew only God. and desired him alone. And it's just so beautiful because you see this whole life play out. It says that as a young boy, his father died very soon in his life. And so it said that God had become his father. Like, it was clear that he no longer had like an earthly father. God had become his soul father. And you see him walking from a young age through this life. And then you get to the point of his death, and you're just overwhelmed with emotion at watching this man practice such heroic virtue in his life, live such deep intimacy, and then pass on to what the book says, the reward of his many virtues.
You know, what's really interesting to me was in the first few chapters, because unfortunately I was only able to read through about page 50 to 60 before the interview. But one of the things that happens very early on in the book is the story of the Immaculate Conception and his relationship with Immaculate Conception. Could you tell that story? And also noting the fact that this happened before the proclamation of the Immaculate Conception. And we have about 3 minutes before we go to a break.
Yeah, so Luis de Ponte, when he was 19 years old, had become involved in the university systems from where he was from. He studied at the College of St. Gregory, I think, of the Dominican College. But he hadn't decided any sort of state in life at this point, and had heard some sermons from this priest with the last name Gutierrez. He was a Jesuit and whatnot. The idea of choosing a state of life, he chose through his sermons to renounce all vain things and renounce the world and take on the habit. And he grew up going to a Dominican church, and his siblings had all become Dominicans. And so the last thing he wanted to do was become a Jesuit. It actually says in the book he had the greatest repugnance at becoming a Jesuit.
Same.
However, one day, now the Immaculate Conception had not been proclaimed dogma at this point. I mean, we're still hundreds of years from that. And so one day, Luis de Ponte starts to doubt this. He doubts this idea of the Immaculate Conception, at which point it says the vein of devotion was dried up in his soul. He had no more consolations,
Yeah, I read that.
more intimate kind of conversations with God. He had been totally dried up. It was like the peak of his, desolation. And so after months, now it's, if I go through any sort of spiritual desolation for 2 minutes, I'm like weeping and, crying and asking why did God abandon me. He went like months on end, like trying to figure this out, talked to many directors, kept praying and persevered, and realized it was because he was doubting the dogma of the belief in the Immaculate Conception, that this vein of devotion dried up in his soul. And Our Lady had chosen him that he may give himself entirely to her. It says that in the story as well. And so he goes and repairs to the altar. Well, at the time, he was also a very renowned intellectual, mainly in theology and philosophy. And so he was asked to give a public disputation. So where it says that he had obviously bound his heart to this belief, he had not bound his tongue yet, and was simply giving reasons, theologically why the Immaculate Conception might not be a thing. And
Hold
at that point,
hold that thought. We interrupted you right at the end there. This was a pretty fascinating story. I read this chapter in the book about how he found himself on the wrong side of the Immaculate Conception argument, and Our Lady gave him such a grace by zapping all of the infused knowledge out of his brain and converting him on this issue. So what happens after that?
So, like I said, he had bound his heart to this belief, but not his tongue, and was asked to give some theological reasons in a scholastic disputation. I mean, because in the scholastic universities, this was common, is you would have people debate an argument and, kind of parse out all the different pieces of the argument and whatnot. And that's how this went. Well, he steps into the room and begins to present, and all of a sudden, all thoughts, all reasons, all arguments, everything that he had prepared was taken from his mind and his memory. So he couldn't recall anything. He was left speechless, and in such like dismay and embarrassment, just like runs out of the room, goes immediately back to the altar of Our Lady, at the local church, and repairs with many tears and heartfelt sorrows and whatnot. And this is the point where he receives his vocation, because like I said, he had a repugnance to joining the Society of Jesus because of how new it was, and he wanted to join the Dominicans because they were much more established and He had seen the opposition to the Jesuits throughout the world. So what he wanted to do was, become a Dominican or become a contemplative. And but he realized at this point, Our Lady gave him his vocation in these two instances because the Jesuits were such, strong defenders of the Immaculate Conception at this point. So he took that as kind of the divine light to assume the habit of the society, of which he does take the habit of the society on the Feast of the Immaculate, or he takes his first vows on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception of 1576. But he had taken the habit of the society 2 years earlier in 1574 at the year of 20, and is sent to the novitiate.
Wow, I love hearing about, solid Jesuits, because the Jesuits we have today, well, it's hit or miss. But he was also famous for spiritual direction and giving the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius. And in the manuscript, it says, "It was said of the exercises, when given by him, we may say what David formerly said of the sword of King Saul and the arrows of Jonathan, that they were never used without taking effect." Can you tell us a little bit more about this part of his life?
Yes. So his life of direction begins somewhat early on. As a newly ordained priest, he's made the director at Villa Garcia of what was the Fathers of the Third Year. And then soon after that, a few months after he's brought to Villa Garcia, the rector there gets moved. And so he becomes the rector, the master of novices, and the director of Fathers of the Third Year of this specific college at Villa Garcia, which huge undertakings and whatnot, of which he takes the Guide of Souls, and it just continually mentions how good he was at this, especially in inspiring devotion, within the heart of those who heard him. And it said that those who would listen to him, would gain more in 1 hour of listening to him than many hours of prayer, just because of how holy and virtuous his exhortations were. And I think what's particularly beautiful about the book, especially in how he presents his life, and especially how it presents the way he directs souls, is he has this specific maternal love, backed with a paternal strength, if you may. Like, he loved with the greatest of tenderness. And reading this book, you hear him speak to his directees, and just unceasingly. He kept his door continually open when he was master of novices and whatnot, for them to come in for anything. And in many ways, he was gifted with graces of reading souls and knowing what was going on at the house at all times. And at one point, this one novice had decided to take his own life in a corner of the house, and Louis de Ponte was so overcome with the understanding that this was about to happen that he sprinted into the room and told him to drop the knife and just pulled him close and told Satan to leave and all of this stuff. And
wow.
You just see what's beautiful about the story is he loves so tenderly. And as these stories are told, you are a part of it. You're a part of his tender love in a way. And talks about, how he would just be so consoling to those who, would fall into melancholy or scruples. And there's almost, for any spiritual dryness or difficulty or tribulation that one would be going through, he would be, there consoling in the right matter, to the degree where princes and kings and, noble people and people from all over would want to have their confessions heard and direction with him. And he obviously preferred to serve the poor, so he was not all that excited that all these princes were coming to talk to him about spiritual matters. But
that's awesome.
One
thing that you reminded me of when you're talking about him running over to save this young novice's life was when he was talking about his success in the confessional. One of the stories, it reads, he found himself so ill from the effects of his journey, joined to his own complaints, as to be almost at death's door. And on reaching the lodgings, he was conveyed to bed, when a young girl appeared, yelling, "Father, Father, come immediately and hear my mother's confession, lest the poor thing should die." This was quite enough to make the holy man forget his own illness. He jumped out of bed and hurried off to help her. But notwithstanding all his haste, on arriving at the woman's house, the same child met him and shrieked, "Oh, my poor mother, the devil has run away with her." The servant of God rebuked her, saying, "Child, what is this disgraceful way of speaking? Go on, where is the sick woman?" The child replied, "Oh, my dear father, my poor mother has died suddenly, and the devil has carried her away. Oh, father, if you only knew what a wicked woman she was." And he goes on that this dreadful recital, the holy man was terrified and humbly adored the tremendous judgments of God, and with the aid of his companion regained the inn, though not without great difficulty. Whenever he related this incident, he always seemed filled with salutary fear. Even in his old age, he used to say, "It is a good thing for me that as far as I was concerned, the poor creature would not have been without help, if when called I had deferred but for one moment. I should have been inconsolable all the rest of my life." Could you talk a little bit about that little passage right there and how that relates to his life and his zeal for souls?
Yeah, I think because when you first started reading that, I thought you were reading the passage about the many hours he would spend on his knees bedside hearing confessions, because he would continually, he just with gout, with any sort of infirmity, he would sometimes be bound to his bed for years. And in the chapters on his virtues, it talks about, for months, and then it was just always recurring. And so he suffered from great infirmities for almost his entire life, and on and off. But sometimes he would spend entire months and months at a time just like constrained to his bed, except for when he had to say mass or hear confessions. And sometimes he would be reduced to such strength that all he could do was kneel bedside and have the penitents come up to the door, and he would hear the confession. And so
that's amazing.
And the Jesuits even had doctors come in on multiple occasions, and the doctors were like, "He's clearly got a physician, and that physician's divine." It's almost like John Vianney, where his life was sustained in health by the work of a miracle. But Luis de Ponte had such a zeal for souls, but also at the same time, as we see kind of with this salutary fear that builds up from this instance, and him judging, understanding the judgments of God, he's incredibly understanding of, like, God is the one who's affecting all of these good things within his soul, and is sustaining him in virtue and sustaining him in these holy works and hearing confessions. And so, it's a great testament to God as the one who makes us saints.
Yeah.
And we're the ones who correspond to those graces. And so he corresponded to the grace to jump up and just, get to this woman's bedside as quickly as possible. To not a victory, however, he understood, that God, it was God's, it was God's action that would save her or not save her, and he was just there to be an instrument.
Now, we are down to just about 2 minutes now left in our conversation with Colton Marks about this book, The Life of the Venerable Louis de Ponte, and it's published by Mediatrix Press. Is there still a cultus around him? I imagine being a sort of a forgotten saint, that not too many people have a veneration to him. Have you had any information on that?
So I did a deep dive one time through kind of some archival, just looking through spiritual writings and whatnot. And he's referred to, at the time, was just greatly venerated. Now, with the turn of the 20th century, you see him being referred to in some spiritual writings by like Father Lassance or a few other spiritual writings. His meditations were published to some degree, his meditations and writings, but most of his stuff hasn't been translated into English. His meditations have. There's been the book on his life, but other than that, the accessibility to his writings have kind of gone out the back door. And so he's a difficult saint or venerable to come across. Just because of the lack of access to his life, and so he's just very little understood. And he's a Spanish saint, and so it's not frequent
praise
that
be
we
to
would
God.
kind of hear about.
Colton Marks, thank you for your time today. It's been a pleasure to get to know this incredible gem of our church, the life of the Venerable Louis de Ponte. It's published by Mediatrix Press. I encourage you to check it out. Go to mediatrixpress.com and search for this book. But Colton Marks, God bless you. God love you. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. God bless you.
All right. Praise be to God. That is going to do it for hour number 1 of Catholic Drive Time. We're very grateful that you hung out with us today.